Hello and welcome to the broadcast. I've got a little something different for you guys today. Recently, I watched Bram Stoker's Dracula, and it got me inspired to look up vampire stuff, and I found something called vampire hysteria, or vampire panic. So yeah, sit back and enjoy what's basically a history lesson. The legend of the vampire surprisingly extends throughout the world. A lot of various cultures in history have had a bloodsucker or an undead in their legends. Like for example, the Strix, the Bahmahan, the Sith, Gyanshi, the Chupacabras. That's the only one I know how to pronounce correctly. And my personal favorite, the Upir. Where do these legends come from? Well, from what I read on Wikipedia, vampires originate from various human fears. These fears come from not yet understood ideas of decomposition, disease, premature burials. That's when you get buried alive. That shit happened a lot back in the day. A more interesting theory though is that vampires are a psychological response. A person's grief, guilt, and passion could have led them to believe that the dead roam, not only as spirits, but as undead beings eager to drain the living. In his 1931 treatise on the nightmare, Welsh psychoanalyst Ernest Jones asserted that vampires are symbolic of several unconscious drives and defense mechanisms. Emotions such as love, guilt, and hate fuel the idea of the return of the dead to the grave, desiring a reunion with the loved ones. Mourners may project the idea that the recently dead must in return yearn the same. From this arises the belief that folkloric vampires and revenants visit relatives, particularly their spouses, first. Another interesting theory is that of psychopathology. Various criminals long past and in modern times have been known to do vampire-like rituals, like that of serial killers Peter Kürten and Richard Trenton Chase. Peter was known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf. He was a German serial killer in the 1920s, known for his brutal crimes and sadistic tendencies. He would go on to be executed in 1931, the fucking psycho. Richard, another dude who was known as the Vampire of Sacramento, was a serial killer from 1977 to 1978. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and believed he had to drink blood in order to survive. A more famous royal chick, the late 16th century Hungarian countess and mass murderer Elizabeth Bathory, became infamous in the later centuries' works which depicted her bathing in her victim's blood to retain her beauty and youth. The old hag reminds me of that dad that siphons his son's blood to like de-age himself, that really weird looking millionaire or billionaire. So it kind of makes sense being ignorant of the decomposition process, seeing somebody go from the living to the death, that accompanied with grief and sorrow and guilt and passion. It's very easy to probably come up with the idea that these relatives and friends come back to life. Then you add like serial killers and mass murderers and people that just are so sadistic they become demons. Now these dead relatives and decomposing bodies become vampires. And that's how legends are pretty much made, I guess. All of these myths and legends and stories all come together to form something called vampire hysteria. What is vampire hysteria? Well, it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. People panicking and freaking out about vampires roaming the shadows of the night, hungry and ready to suck the blood out of anyone unlucky enough to cross their path. It's very similar to the whole Salem witch trial stuff, although with some notable differences, obviously, because these are vampires, and those were like just random women being accused of witchcraft. Not that it's funny, but it's just, unfortunate. We are going to talk about two very curious instances in which this phenomena became a reality. We start with the Great New England Vampire Panic. Title card. We start our tale in New England 1990 with some kids finding a freaking graveyard in Griswold, Connecticut. The whole thing was first believed to be the work of a serial killer, Michael Ross, but it was later determined to be a colonial graveyard with 29 burials. They were all typical to the era, except for the 4th grave. In one of the stone crypts, the archaeologist assigned to the site, Nick Bellantoni, discovered a red coffin. All the other dead seemed relatively normal. You know, bones in the usual order, but this one had been beheaded, and its thigh bones and skull now sat atop of their ribcage and vertebra. How peculiar. 200 years after the Salem witch trials in the 19th century, several New England states were plagued by tuberculosis, a disease that was thought to be the result of the dead feeding on their relatives. In reality, it was just a normal disease, but back then people didn't know. They didn't know any better. So of course the logical step was attributing it with vampires. Tuberculosis spreads very easily, and you can imagine if one of your family members gets it, you're all gonna get it, and eventually die slowly, one by one, right? That makes sense. These people would go on to believe that those that died first were now vampires feeding off their still living members. They came to this conclusion in various ways, but mostly it was because people really didn't know much about decomposition. I assume back then seeing and studying dead people was very uncommon, and you'd probably end up being labeled a madman and be burned as a witch or some shit like that. Nevertheless, a very fresh corpse was considered a vampire. This was especially true if the person still had liquid blood in their organs. So how would they get rid of their vampiric relatives? Well, there was a couple of ways. You could burn the organs in a ritualistic style, the corpses could be decapitated, or even simply just turning the freaking body around could do the trick. What was really messed up is that sometimes during the burning, the other sick but still very alive family members would inhale the smoke, and you can just imagine the lung disease would just get so much worse. Oh, and they also ate the fucking ashes. They ate them. They ate the fucking ashes. The New England vampire panic wasn't the first though. The first vampire panic, or at least the one that was recorded, was that of Peter Blagojevich. Blagojevich. That's what I'm gonna call it, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced it. Peter died in 1725 in the village of Kislova, an area that passed from Ottoman control to Austrian and then back to Ottoman. His passing was then followed by 9 separate deaths. The legend goes that these people saw Peter as they were dying, and the deadly vampire throttled them at night. He also went to his wife and asked for his shoes, and I guess she refused. That kinda rhymed. She ended up skipping town because she felt unsafe. In another legend, Peter went to his son and asked for some food, and the little shit refused. This caused Peter to viciously attack his son and take his life. The fears were so real that this village demanded that Peter's corpse be examined for signs of vampirism. So here's how you can tell if someone is a vampire, after you've, of course, dug up the corpse out of the grave. So if this person has a new beard, or if their nails are growing, or if they look a little too fresh, that's a vampire. That's an undead. You gotta take it out. You gotta put a stake in their belly. I honestly didn't know that most vampire fears and myths came from people just being ignorant about how dead bodies react with like the soil and how they just sort of decay with time. It's very interesting. It's very cool. And I'm not saying I'm any smarter than these guys. If I was a 17th century peasant, I would also be with them by their side eating those ashes. So it makes sense that the villagers were pretty freaked out about the whole situation and then possibly being murdered by a vampire. So they couldn't really wait for the official declaration of exhuming the corpse. So they got the local priest and an imperial provisor, Ernest Frombold, and they dug the poor guy out, and what they found shocked them. Peter was said to be undecomposed. Facial hair had grown, his old hair and nails had fallen off, and new stuff had grown back. And most importantly, his mouth was stained with crimson blood. You could hear the screams and outrage throughout the crowd, and logically the beast was staked in the heart. This resulted in completely fresh blood to gush out of the ears and mouths of good old Pete. You know, surprisingly, Peter's situation wasn't isolated to like a little remote village. It was part of the 18th century vampire panic in Germany, England, and France. So these legends and superstitions and instances of people becoming vampires, allegedly, would now make up the modern vampire myth. That's mostly like seen on TV and movies and stuff like that. I think my favorite depiction of these creatures is the Van Helsing movies. The way that Dracula transforms and the whole dark aesthetic of the creature and his wives looked really nice. And of course the werewolf transformation was like sweet. So yeah, that's what vampire panic or vampire hysteria is. It's pretty much people freaking out about the way bodies decompose. So I hope you enjoyed that. I think so far this has been my favorite script to do. So I hope you liked it too. Good night, and hope to see you here again on the next episode. Bye!